Hello, Milwaukee Bucks fans. Welcome back to Bucks Latest presented by Fan Arch. I'm your host, Dean Simon. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We are still very much on the road to 1,000 subscribers. So if you could potentially hit that big red button on the bottom, I would really, really appreciate that. Also, if you could turn on post notifications to stay up to date and in the know with all the latest Milwaukee Bucks updates, that would be greatly appreciated as well. All right, first thing on the docket is that the Bucks. It seems as though maybe they were a little bit more serious about a potential Andrew Wiggins deal with the Miami Heat than previously believed, because a report from Clutch Points Brett Siegel came out basically saying that the Bucks did inquire about a potential trade for 2022 NBA champion, mind you, Andrew Wiggins, and he said, and I quote, that the Heat were willing to deal Wiggins if they received an instant impact player along with an upcoming first round pick before 2028. So we can see now, based on that little tidbit, where the potential for a deal between the Bucks and the Heat, at least from a draft compensation standpoint, would have just completely fallen apart because obviously the Bucks can't offer a first round pick that comes before 2028 or 2029 or 2030. They would only have had that 2031 first round pick to potentially offer in a deal. So it would have been the 2031 pick, which is one of the most valued picks in the entirety of the NBA. At least, that's how it's widely viewed. So it would have been that 2031 pick, maybe a guy like Kyle Kuzma to make the money match, even though I think he makes no, I think he makes a little bit less than Wiggins, but neither here nor there. You would need a salary like Kyle Kuzma's, maybe a guy like AJ Green or something, or Ajax, to get the deal to really come together and to potentially get it across the finish line. But it seems as though that just wasn't in the cards because of the Heat's wants and demands in terms of draft compensation. And of course, we knew that this was going to put the Bucks in an extremely complicated situation with regard to making any trade, because how are they going to do this when they have limited numbers of players that have decent enough salary range to put them together in a trade, and they don't have any draft capital. So it really stinks that a deal like this wasn't able to come to fruition, or really move past any kind of mark in terms of if the deal was really gonna start gaining momentum or whatever. Like, they didn't really make it to any point in the negotiation where like it was at the 1 yard line or anything. But the fit with Wiggins potentially joining Giannis and Miles Turner on the Bucks, it's undeniable. It just because of the two-way work that he did for the Warriors in 2022, helping them to win the title. He was arguably the second best player on the championship team. So, guarding Jason Tatum with every fiber of his being, and still scoring pretty efficiently on the other end. All-star that year, of course, and he was able to do all these things. I won't say with ease, but it looked as though it was weird. Him in the finals, like, it looked as though he had been there before and that he had had that kind of experience as that go-to two-way guy that can guard the opposing team's best player on the perimeter, and still hold his own from an offensive perspective. But that was really Andrew Wiggins just growing into that role in real time, and it's possible that he could very well do the same exact thing for another prospective championship contending team, whether that would have been the Bucks if they were able to get a deal done that, it's going to be lost to history, I guess, because it's out the window. But it definitely would have been a very, very cool situation to potentially have Wiggins, Giannis, Miles Turner as the 3 through 5 on, like, for their nightly rotation. It would have been pretty great to watch just in terms of their defensive potential. That trio together would have been insane. But another guy that could possibly jump into the fold as one of the best defenders on the Milwaukee Bucks behind Giannis and behind Miles Turner is Ryan Rollins, who he was recently named by Dalton Sell, a fan sided a writer that we've covered his stuff pretty often here, because he's just very talented at what he does. He came out and basically said that Ryan Rollins, he might be one of the biggest steals in the NBA of this offseason, based on his production, or at least what he showed that he could do in limited minutes this past season, and what he can be next year, and based on the contract that he received, which was a 3-year $12 million deal to bring him back to the Bucks. And so $4 million a year for a guy that showed real two-way potential at the point guard spot, which is something that the Bucks have desperately needed since the departure of Drew Holiday. Um, so just his pure athleticism, his ability to move his feet, and he has quick hands. He's able to get out in passing lanes and tip passes, and he's just great at hounding guys on ball. He's just an all-around fantastic perimeter defender. and his athleticism translates to the other end of the floor when he's running in transition. He also proved to be a great shooter, north of 40% from 3 point range. Ryan Rollins did a lot of impressive stuff in 2024-25, and now this salary, it really very well could make him one of the steals of the of the offseason, excuse me. But something from this article where Dalton Sell mentions this and he kind of puts this into a bigger perspective is he made the comparison that Ryan Rollins is akin to Nikhil Alexander Walker in some ways. And I think it's an excellent comparison. But I think the thing that, and this gets me excited for Ryan Rollins. I think the main difference between the two is that Ryan Rollins will have more of an impact on ball on the offensive side, where he's going to get more familiar with pick and roll schemes with Giannis and Miles Turner. He'll have that opportunity to develop more as a passer and a lead playmaker when it's him, the ball handler, Giannis the screener in certain actions. It probably won't happen more than once or twice a game, but he'll get valuable reps that will just get him more in tune with what the Bucks are trying to do in the half court. And again, that's where things kind of differ with a guy like Nikhil Alexander Walker, because while those guys are extremely similar as defenders, Nikhil Alexander Walker is looked at more as a corner 3 point threat, like their catch and shoot guy who's also one of the best perimeter defenders off the bench in the NBA. But Ryan Rollins just has more, of a chance to impact winning on the ball with the ball in his hands as the not necessarily the primary playmaker, but when the time calls for it, he can certainly step into that role, and maybe we'll see development from him in that aspect. But he's still so young; he still has a long way to go. But that's why you're happy the Bucks were able to get him down for a long-term deal at the price point that they did, and maybe it won't be this year because they're going to have a lot of stuff to figure out with their rotations and whether it's going to be KPJ starting and then Cole Anthony off the bench, and where Ryan Rollins is going to really slot into the rotation. But the year after this one, and in the third year of this deal, you could really see this start to pay off, and that's where you could really see it start to become the steal of the 2025 offseason, because there's just with a whole new configuration of guys, especially at the point guard spots, there's going to be a lot of turnover, and guys aren't necessarily going to stick as the starter, as the primary go-to guy off the bench, and Ryan Rollins will have a chance to move around the rotation and kind of you know get his feet wet in different areas, and this is where we can really see him start to develop. So this year will be a major step forward for him, but I'm thinking next season, 2026-27, that's really going to mark the start of his breakout, and that's where we're really going to like look back to the 2025 offseason being like, yeah, this was one of the steals of the offseason, and a complete steal for the Milwaukee Bucks to get him back for that price point. Anyways, moving forward, NBA analyst Jake Weinback, he recently said some positive things about the Milwaukee Bucks, and I feel like that's not something that we have come across in recent episodes or in recent weeks after the Bucks decided to wave and stretch Miles Turner, or wave and stretch Damian Lillard, bring in Miles Turner to, counteract that, and as a result of that, and then bringing back guys like Gary Trent Jr. and Torian Prince and Ryan Rollins, Bobby Portis, of course, lost Brooke Lopez as well, but most NBA talking heads are not really giving the Bucks any kind of credit when it comes to these decisions, or they're not giving the front office, John Horst, any kind of credit. I feel like they're more or less just like being talked down upon, and they're basically saying that all the moves that the Bucks did, even though they were obviously very calculated, they were more moves out of desperation, and that some have gone even as far as to say that they were embarrassing. And you think of Bill Simmons in this aspect, where immediately after the moves were done, he was just the first one to rant and rave about how dumb these decisions were, and how obviously desperate it looked from the Bucks front office perspective. But then in the weeks following, he kind of retracted his statements and kind of walked them back. But anyways, besides the point, Jake Weinbach, he was just very openly positive about the Bucks moves, and he wasn't jumping through the ceiling and really, trying to get it across that the Bucks had the best offseason of any team in the NBA, but that he just, in my opinion, he really did a great job of leveling with the rest of, the NBA world, saying, what the Bucks did wasn't that terrible. At least in the position that they were in to begin the offseason, how they managed to get through it and where and what resulted out of it, it definitely was a lot better than what it could have been. Again, like with circumstance involved and taken into account. And he said, and I quote, "The Bucks did well to surround Giannis Antetokounmpo with high-value role players given the circumstances this offseason. Milwaukee no longer has co-stars around Giannis, but they have a strong supporting cast that complements the franchise superstar on both ends of the floor." And simple statement, but you really can't help but agree. And this is again simple statement, but you feel like you don't really see many guys, on first take on ESPN or NBA Today or whatever, kind of getting around the table in their little panel discussions and saying good things about what the Bucks did. Again, like you have to take into account the circumstances and the fact that Damian Lillard wasn't going to play the entirety of this next season. And what were they possibly going to do with that in mind and with Giannis still wanting to win. And again, at the time, you have to take into account the Giannis trade rumors were reaching an absolute fever pitch, and that was really the point where it was so unpredictable. You had no idea whether he was going to actually request a trade or not. And the way that they were able to turn it around, bring back their key guys from this past year, again, like Gary Trent, like Torian Prince, who had great years for the Bucks, bringing them back was the best possible thing that they could do, along with bringing in Miles Turner, and they did it. They could have just as easily lost both of those previously mentioned guys, Gary Trent and Torian Prince, to other teams on higher annual salaries because they were definitely deserving of them. But they were able to re-sign these guys, kind of convince them to stay and keep building this thing alongside Giannis, and hopefully they can contend in the East. So they were able to accomplish a lot of their goals. And while losing Damian Lillard and having to pay him $22.5 million a year, just, in dead cap over the next half decade, like it's just gone, it stinks. But it's probably the best thing that they could have done given the circumstances. So thank you, Jake Weinback, for, you know, leveling with NBA media and NBA fans alike and just telling them, you know what the Bucks did wasn't too bad. But we'll finish things off today by talking about a little prediction from Clutch Points Caleb Nixon, who came out and said that the Milwaukee Bucks, of course, they're kind of missing that defensive wing that can really set the tone on that end of the floor, and they have been missing it for the past couple of years, and it's really an area of need for this club. And Dylan Brooks could potentially be a good option in trade pursuits and in trade conversations, though I do have my reservations about Dylan Brooks because, of course, he's a guy where he's like a Patrick Beverly, where if he's on the other team, you hate his guts, but if he's with you, then you're riding and dying for Dylan Brooks and you love everything he's doing. But just with the recent turnover, of course, he had a pretty great year for the Houston Rockets this past year. Now heading to the Phoenix Suns. Um, you know, I feel like with guys that move from multiple teams to another, like he goes from the Rockets to the Suns, potentially to the Bucks in a very short amount of time, that it's kind of jarring for a lot of guys and they aren't really themselves. Like for that first whole season where they're with the latest team, in this case it would be the Bucks. But he's still a pretty great option in terms of his improved three-point shooting this past year. Obviously, we know him as the former all defensive team player that he is, taking on the most competitive matchups every night. He's out there offering to guard Steph Curry and guard LeBron James, guard Kevin Durant on any given night. He wants those matchups, and that's a guy that you love to have. Um, so it really wouldn't be a terrible option. But anyways, Caleb Dixon, he said, for a team that's lacked edge and competitive grit since Holiday's departure, Dylan Brooks is another viable option. He's coming off a career year from three-point range, shooting nearly 40% for the Houston Rockets last season. But his impact is mostly present on the defensive end and through his personality. He likes to get under the opponent's skin, and oftentimes it works to Brooks' advantage. Financially, it'd be a lot easier for the Bucks to acquire Brooks. He's making just over $21 million this season, and the contract declines in 2026-27, the final year of the deal. Which is kind of crazy that I feel like his contract has moved pretty quickly because I feel like it was just yesterday when I was talking about him signing that. I believe it was a 4-year, $80 million deal to join the Rockets, and it just at the time it looked to be like somewhat of an overpay. Again, like with taking the situation into account where he was coming off of a year with the Grizzlies where he was basically just, public enemy number one for the entirety of the NBA fan base and by the Grizzlies themselves. They said that there's no way that they're bringing him back under any circumstances, and his image was completely shot. But now in 2025, $21 million a year for a player of his caliber could be seen as an underpay, or at least it could be seen as, like, just the right number as an annual salary. And that just goes to show how crazy NBA money is getting nowadays. But a guy like Dylan Brooks, he could certainly completely change around the Bucks culture and really bring that fire that they've needed for the past couple of years again, ever since Drew Holiday left and they lost their best perimeter defender. Dylan Brooks could, reinstitutionalize that kind of that fire and grit on the defensive end that the Bucks have needed for a couple of years now. And I really don't think it would be a bad option if they were to pursue him in any potential trade. Maybe they go to the Suns and say, "Hey, take on Kyle Kuzma, take the." Maybe they don't want to give the 2031 pick, but to get a guy like Dylan Brooks, who really is a game changer, maybe they do offer to do so. They say, "Take Kyle Kuzma, take the pick." Again, take a guy like AJ Green or whatever, even though you would love to keep him. Um, Give him to a Suns team that, they're just trying to get on dead salary and take on draft compensation, and they're going to try and do a little soft rebuild or a retool around Devin Booker and now Jalen Green. So there's always the possibility that something like that could be worked out, and a guy like Dylan Brooks who wants to compete for a title as quickly as possible, he moves to the Bucks where he can, accomplish that goal. But all remains to be seen. Definitely, probably one of the more realistic options in terms of trade targets for the Bucks going into 25, 26, and at least approaching the trade deadline. But anyways, that'll be it for me today. Thank you very much for watching another episode of Bucks Latest presented by Fan Arch. Again, I've been Dean Simon. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to stay up to date and in the know with all the latest Milwaukee Bucks updates. I will see you guys in the next one, and go Bucks.